Ward. Yep, I'm tackling it. Today, I'm going to dive in and talk about this relatively new mechanic and its future in Magic. Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And lately, there's been a lot of discussion around the Ward ability, which makes sense coming off of murders at Karlov Manor and the built-in ward on cloaked creatures. So, let me tell you about it from a Magic design side. Here we go. Alright, so before we get to Ward today and what's happening there, it's important to know how we got here. Since the dawn of Magic, creatures have died to removal. As the meme goes, it dies to Doomblade. Except back in Alpha, it was more like dies to Tear. Or in Homelands, dies to Broken Visage. And the reason Homelands is relevant is because Autumn Willow is the first creature with built-in untargetable. It technically showed up first on some cards with activated abilities like Homerid Warrior, but Autumn Willow is the first card that came with it always. And I know it might look embarrassing by today's standards, but back in the day, this card was a house. One of the best cards in all of Homelands, which I guess isn't really saying much. But the reason why it was so good was exactly that untargetability. You could cast your creature, and if it resolved, your opponent couldn't easily kill it, especially at a time in Magic where the answers were so much cheaper and more efficient than the threats. Something unassailable like this was game-changing. It made the top 8 of Pro Tour New York in 1996 in the hands of Eric Tam, Bertrand Lestrie, and Preston Poulter. And not to be outdone, in the very next set, Alliances, this happens.
This is Mark Rosewater. I'm here with Mark Justice, and we're here at the finals of the third stop on the Magic the Gathering Professional Tour. On the left, Sean Fleischman of New York. On the right, Ali Raid of Sweden, about to play for $22,000. Yeah, and the thing with Ali's deck is he doesn't need too many creatures. Just a few of them, they start whacking it pretty quickly.
Go.
Yeah, and that Deadly Insect, that's a big problem. Pyroclasm is the only way for Fleischman to get it out once it's in play.
9?
Sean does have his Pyroclasm this game for the Deadly Insect. He has 4. I mean, he has plenty of defense for that.
The Swedes chalk one up.
Yeah, they can do anything.
I think at Worlds will be actually the
next card's a land. The next card was a land.
Next card was a land.
Yes, that's right. Deadly Insect won the Pro Tour with 4 main deck copies, 4 in the hands of Ole Rade. Can't be targeted really did its job against a litany of pinpoint removal. And after that, cards with this ability showed up every now and then, from Zephid to Blurred Mongoose to Kodama of the North Tree. There weren't a ton, but these kind of effects could play an important role in Constructed, as threats that control decks which just sat behind a hand of removal were forced to interact with in other ways. And casually, they were just popular as a creature your opponent couldn't kill. Hey, that just feels good. So, finally, in Future Sight of all places, we introduced it as a keyword, Shroud. It made its way into Magic from there, and all formerly can't be the target of spells or abilities cards, like Pincher Beetles, were updated when they were reprinted. We started using it a little bit more, which often happens when we introduce a keyword, but still not that much. But a few years go by of us making more Shroud cards than normal, and we start hearing some pretty consistent feedback from people. What is it? They want to be able to target their own things. With auras, combat tricks, and more around, players both got confused and thought they could target their own things, and when they realized they couldn't, they just got sad. So, after a lot of discussion, a decision was made. And in 2011, just 4 years after Shroud was printed for the first time on Quagnoth, Shroud was retired. What replaced it in Magic 2012 was a new mechanic, hexproof. On only 6 cards in the set, this mechanic was a fixed Shroud. You could target the creature and your opponent couldn't. Perfect. Problem solved, right? Well, as a certain Slippery Bogle and Gladecover Scout might have taught you, not so much. While people did want to target their Shroud creatures, it turns out a lot of that, when it happened early and easily, was just not all that fun. Even just plopping down a Trollhide in Limited on a hexproof creature could lead to a very frustrating experience, let alone when people eventually started casting Daybreak Coronet on them in Constructed. To fast forward a little bit here, what we've learned through the years is that a small amount of hexproof can be fun. It's most fun on combat tricks as a way to grant the mechanic temporarily and stop removal. It can also be fun in server role on more expensive to cast cards. Going back to Autumn Willow and Deadly Insect for a moment, part of what made those work is they were expensive threats you didn't want to just get offed by a 2-mana removal spell. They needed the protection to not trade down in mana. But 1 and 2 mana cards, those are the ones that should be a lot more vulnerable. Cards like Carnage Tyrant are much more the place for this. A modern day dinosaur Autumn Willow, if you will. There's also fun in sometimes hexproof, like Miriam, who grants hexproof on your turn so your opponent can interact on their turn still, and hexproof from certain things, like Eradicator Valkyrie, so your opponent needs to diversify their answers. We still do hexproof, especially on combat tricks, but you've probably noticed us tone it down a lot. So, what is the solution here? How do we get to put this kind of effect on cheaper creatures? And that's where Ward came from. It first showed up in Strixhaven, inspired by the ability on Frost Titan. The idea here is it's a mechanic we could put on smaller creatures so they couldn't be efficiently removed, but could still be taken care of late. With these, you wouldn't have the Glade Cover Scout problem, where you put all your eggs in one creature's basket and then your opponent can never kill it. Toadstool Admirer, for example, eventually just becomes something you can pay a little bit more mana and remove. Ward has done a lot of good things for us and is an upgrade in a lot of ways. It's nice to feel like you can, theoretically, interact with the permanent. But just like Shroud and Hexproof, we've learned a lot about it after deploying it for a few years. Let me go through some big ones. First, the numbers are really deceiving. 3 mana doesn't seem like very much in Magic, but when you're staring down Ward 3, it suddenly feels like infinite. Because you have to spend the mana on your removal spell, plus 3 additional mana, it is so hard to remove the creature without spending your whole turn, if you even have the mana to do that. And if the creature they cast generated any kind of value at all, it's brutal to spend your whole turn dealing with their ward threat and then still have whatever it created left over. Second, it also has a bit of an unintuitive effect here when it comes to Commander. Commander games go long and players have tons of mana. So the thinking was at that time, that would mean that big ward costs, like on Neverwinter Hydra and Kappa Cannoneer, should be fine, right? Well, not so much. You might have the mana eventually, sure, but spending your entire turn dealing with one player's creature while 3 other players get to do things sets you up to have a tempo loss against not just 1, but 3 players. What I see happen most often is nobody wants to deal with it, so it just ends up as semi-hexproof until someone is eventually forced to spend their whole turn doing it, and then that player falls quickly behind. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't put Ward on commander cards at all, and I know why we put it on some commanders that you really need to untap with to do anything or your deck falls apart. But it's something to be careful about, for sure. Also, there's the problem that Kappa Cannoneer broke out in Legacy, which was definitely not our intention, and then really was impossible to kill. Oops. Third, Ward really impacts the ability to spend multiple cards to kill off one thing. This especially hurts red, which is the color most likely to do this. If you have 2 shocks, paying Ward 2 twice to target the same creature twice is brutal and often untenable. Fourth, it's most fun in small doses. It's nice to be able to protect a creature or 2. But when there's a ton of ward rolling around, it makes everything feel expensive and like a slog to cast, and it can still lead to frustration to play against. One thing we tend to do is when we keyword something, it just always finds its way onto lots of cards. And with Ward, maybe it ended up, in my opinion, on a couple too many places. I think we've probably given it out a little too freely. Hey, just put Ward 1 or 2 on that, it'll be fine. And to be clear, I'm guilty of this too. I think it was me that suggested Ward for Tivit, Seller of Secrets, which definitely did not need it. Ward is something we just really need to do to make sure with intention and not like a throw-in on a card. One little thought exercise for you that I've thought a lot about is if Ward 1 or Ward 2 was the right thing for cloaks in Murders at Karlov Manor. It really impacted the removal in the set, even though we did have some tricks up our sleeve like can't be countered. That said, it's pretty hard to get 3 mana 2/2s into decks, so ultimately it is probably what needed to be there, but like I said, it's an interesting thought exercise regardless. And finally, the 5th thing, non-mana Ward that people can consistently pay for has been pretty fun. For example, I really enjoy Sedgemoor Witch and Graveyard Trespasser. I never feel like I can deal with them, and I don't take a tempo hit to make it happen, but I get to choose if it's worth the cost or not. Now, With all of that said, here's how I'm personally thinking about Ward going forward. Note that I don't want to speak for every designer, nor say this is definitively how it's going to be, but it is exactly the kind of feedback I'm giving when people show me their cards right now. Alright, so Ward 1 is something nice to have to help generate a little bit of tempo on a permanent. It protects your creature a bit more in limited and matters a lot in constructed, where mana efficiency is huge. Even then, it should not just be given out freely or just because, it should have a purpose. Ward 2 is a serious addition to pay. 2 mana doesn't sound like a ton, but turning a 2 mana removal spell into a 4 mana one is a huge difference. These should be cards that really need protection. A good case for Ward 2 on cloaks, given that 3 mana 2/2s are very vulnerable. In Commander, this should be on something that promotes fun gameplay, so we're happy with it staying around, and something that the player really needs to survive and not die right away. Part of the justification to it to me, on Felix 5 boots as an example, is that if you play it, attack and try and get your triggers, and it dies right away, it's such a blowout and a feel bad. Getting to do it at least once is really nice. Ward 3 should not show up very often. This should mostly be on more expensive cards that we don't want to be removed easily and that we want the opponent to have to untap and spend mana on their turn to get rid of. I like this the most on 6 drops and higher, but it should be deployed sparingly. This is too high in most instances for commanders. For example, Ward 3 on Voja was likely at least 1 too high, and that's only talking commander. The card has other applications too. Ward 4 and higher is something we should almost never deploy. There are times maybe to do it, but it should be on expensive to cast cards and ones that are special in some way and done extremely sparingly. I could imagine times where maybe instead of doing hexproof, we'll do something like Ward 4, so it is answerable sometimes instead of never. When I see Ward 4, I'm essentially going to think of it as hexproof you could maybe someday buy out of. But yeah, no more Kappa Cannoneers. Ward of non-mana payments, I'm generally in favor of, provided the thing can be accomplished by a typical Magic deck. And of course, special exceptions can happen for expensive or notable characters. And that's how I break it down. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments down below. Like Hexproof and Shroud before it, there are fun and not so ways to deploy the Ward mechanic, and as we're learning, we're going to keep turning the knobs to find the right ones. One of the many things I love about my job is how we get to launch something, learn, and keep making it better over time. So with all of this said, in case it's not clear, I believe the mechanic is good for Magic, and also that we should probably be at least a bit more judicious about how it's used going forward. So over the next couple years, keep in mind we work on long timelines here, I'll be very curious to see what your reactions are. I'll talk with you again soon, and until then, may you have the mana you need to pay your Ward costs. You got this. Okay, so these days we generally treat all the color combinations equally in terms of rare standard legal dual lands. It has such a huge impact on standard what lands are available. So we either do all 10 dual lands in a single set, like the Murders at Karlov Manor Surveil lands, or we release them over a couple sets, like we did with the Pathways in both